being in many respects systematically attacked and marginalized. And I'm just so excited to have Tim and West here to guide us through this discussion. So we'll give it another 20 seconds and then we'll get this show on the road. I also want to point out that in addition to these kinds of issues which affect members of the LGBTQ plus community, we also are seeing these kinds of tactics being used to marginalize others. And we have covered on this show attacks against AAPI, Asian and Pacific Islander communities. We've talked the issues with Native American communities and African American communities, and Jewish communities, in Latino and Hispanic communities. So the whole idea here is that if we're going to create a society for our future, this idea of crossing over our own divisions, our own identities, and embracing the identities and ways of being across different religions and across different ethnicities, that is what we're about. If we're going to create the America that we want to live in, an America that embraces us, we have to be ready to embrace others. So let's get the show on the road. I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll move forward. Welcome, Oppenheimer. Today we're discussing the increasing attacks against LGBTQ plus folks, and particularly trans folks across the United States, and especially across the American South, with special guests, Tim and West, Executive Director of LGBTQ plus Institute at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that your questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So Timon, thank you so much for joining us. Let's just set this up because it's just insane what is happening. It seemed that for a long time, we were going toward greater and greater acceptance. I'm certainly old enough to know the time and have very, very stark memories going back into my own family of people being closeted in very separated and apartheid kind of way of having people, members of the LGBTQ plus community, having secret communities in a self-protected way. We had the Stonewall riots that was a rebellion against that type of suppression. And for a long, long time, we seem to have gone toward greater acceptance until we've had this recent blowback. What is your view of the trajectory of history and where we are now?
Yeah, it's really interesting that we are at this particular point. I joined the board, the inaugural board of the LGBTQ Institute, which essentially is a little background, it builds a bridge between advocates and academics. So the idea of the Institute is to leverage things like research and history as a way of sort of building power in communities. And when I joined the board, it was 2015. I think President Obama was still in office. And if you had told me and our other board members that 8 years later we would be where we are now, we would have been like, no, we thought we were moving direction around things like inclusion, rights for people. And I think there's just been, in part, due to toxic rhetoric and scapegoating people that seem the most vulnerable. Right. It's interesting to me, Mark, that there was bipartisan support for the Protect Marriage Act, right, which, protects marriage and so there's even an extent to which cisgender queer people like myself are seen as kind of okay, but like we need someone that we can pick on and vilify. And right now that's the trans and the non-binary community. And even some people in our community have also marginalized those groups of people. There's rhetoric out there saying that community is really holding gay and lesbian folks back as opposed to being more inclusive. And so our idea is to really just generate more awareness about what's happening. The violence is picking up, in particular among LGBTQ youth. Rates of suicidality and depression are spiking. And in part, Mark, due to the rhetoric in the media, and there's constantly rhetoric on the news about your identity not being valid or not being a real person, it's hurtful. And I think as I work, the Institute is a project or a program of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. One of the things I think is really important about that is that I'm committed to resituating LGBTQ rights and trans rights as human rights. If we can agree that transgender people are human, particular rights to access to healthcare, to education that others of us are. And I think the rhetoric is intending to dehumanize that category of people, to pathologize transgender people, dismiss them. And I think that's the travesty. And I think more than anything, allies, both straight and in the LGBTQ community, need to say, hey, I may not understand the aspect of a trans person, but they are a person, they are human, and they are endowed certain rights.
The standard of having to understand every particular aspect of a human being is ridiculous. I mean, I don't understand every particular aspect of myself, my wife, my kids. Come on. I mean, the fact is that I don't understand every particular aspect of you, right? But we can chat and you can share part of who you are with me. The thing that really distresses me is that the tactics that are at play here seem to be immortal tactics of identifying the weakest members of a particular society.
Yes, absolutely.
Then othering them, and then using language to create a with slaves that are in this country and creating a whole language set and a whole way of treatment and a whole system to create categorization that would be acceptable, more socialized, to treat people in that category who were Black in a certain way. And we're seeing this now with smallest, the most marginalized individuals. And I think that we can act. Is that really how we want to treat, even if we don't understand someone?
Right.
Is that really how we want to treat someone who could be our child, our son, our daughter, our uncle, or, I mean, we ought to try to understand if they're different, right? You and I should be trying to understand each other. Shouldn't we try to understand someone who has a different orientation or identity than me?
Absolutely. And what's interesting is a lot of this hinges on this new sort of parent right stuff, right? Like that we want parents to have rights. One, there's a kind of essentialization of the category of parent, as if all parents believe the same things about how they want to raise kids. We talk about banning books because they're not good for kids, but like, which parents are we talking about? My mom let me loose at the library and said, go forth and read, right? And I got to have critical engagement with text that resonated with me and didn't resonate with me. And I think that that's a part of our intellectual and psychological development as people in this country to have access to that. The banning is saying that there's one group of parents that we're going to privilege as the right ones. And any parent that doesn't agree with this particular way then therefore loses their rights. I think that's the dangerous thing that's happening in places like Florida right now, where, everything from books being censored and banned to certain types of curriculum. And so it speaks to a real hypocrisy.
So I think it also goes... a libertarian, or you are basically live and let live, let different parents have different parenting styles and not try to impose my parenting style on you, right?
I think it's very dangerous, right? I think it's a really dangerous, slippery slope to start to legislate how parents can raise their kids. So on one side, you have people that say, you know what, supporting a trans trying to get passed that would actually criminalize parents for saying, you know what, my kid is gender non-binary, or that they feel like they were born in the wrong body. And I want to actually support them by taking them through vetted and psychologically appropriate care to get those conversations, to get the care that they need. There's vast evidence out there that when children who are in that space and adults alike receive that care, that there are people that will call that abuse. On the other side, you have people that say, you know what, if you kick your trans kid out because they're trans or non-binary or LGBTQ, then that's abuse, right? Now, I certainly have my own opinion about that, but being criminalized because they believe a particular thing.
Yeah, I'm with you. You know, we work for a whole bunch of different people, and not everybody has the exact same values that I particularly have, or that any of our people, by people who are trying to improve civil society and give each other space. That's basically what you're saying, is that instead of legislating, creating one set of rules that all of a sudden create a state coercion on parents or a state coercion on individuals.
And I think importantly, there is a piece of this, right? And this is where the research becomes very important to me. There's kind of this movement aligned with some of the toxic rhetoric that is like, throw science out, right? Like that people get to spew and make cases for arguments that are like either based on really bad research or like research from maybe some kind of evangelical fundamentalist Christian think tank, right? As opposed to like the American Psychological Association or the American Pediatrics Association. You have these really strong vetted institutions that have done the research to say, like, this is healthy, and that people have done a lot of work to get to that point. And yet you have these mythologies often spread through things like social media that a lot of people are latching on to. Trans kids aren't being mutilated at 2 and 3 years old or 4 and 5 years old. There's a process that they have to go through, which includes psychological evaluation, getting to an appropriate age to even take something like hormone blockers, which would simply delay the process of maturing into the gender at birth. And so it's in our recent LGBTQ Southern survey, and a lot of our work focuses on the South because, one, contrary to what a lot of people know, about a third of the U.S. LGBTQ population resides in the South. And when we think of San Francisco, the Bay Area, we think about New York, maybe Chicago, these areas. But like when you think about the fact that like a very substantial population of people who are LGBTQ live in the South, and yet that is where the bulk of the legislation that's not only being proposed, but passing. I'm right here in the state of Georgia, and gender affirming care is banned, right? So you do have families that have the privilege of saying, you know what, we're going to move to another state that's more progressive where we can continue to care for our child. But I said a few times, that's a luxury that many or most families can't afford, to just, we're going to go to another state. And my fear is that families will have to resort to underground methods, to things that may not actually be healthy, to try to navigate those spaces and take care of their children, which is why I think that this is really, really important issues and work, and that we need to do a lot to educate people, who maybe don't understand on like, what does it mean to be trans or non-binary? But I think fundamentally, what does it mean to preserve and fight for and maintain families' rights and children's right to sort of live and thrive just like other people?
What do you think the role of government is? I've always been where I thought, okay, government should basically have the lowest, we should have the smallest government we could possibly afford. We should have the least interventionist government that we can possibly afford. And government's role is things like assuring common defense, setting standards for the nation, keeping people safe, making sure that minorities have voice, and that the majority doesn't Bigfoot minorities and so on.
Mm-hmm.
What is your view of what this role is? Because we do have, this is a government, is these laws and so on, trying to legislate what I can do, in terms of with my family or whatever can or cannot do. What's your view?
And, it really exposes a hypocrisy of a group of, just a few years ago, we're talking about like, we don't want the government in our lives, right? And yet you see this turn where like, it's okay for the government to be in the lives of people as long as it agrees with my values, right? And so I think that's the real hypocrisy, but I think needs to step in to legislate and ensure don't, as you put, get bigfooted by the majority. We know, for example, that's been the real importance of a Supreme Court that can legislate in a way that's like best, right? We know that like if the ending slavery was put up to a democratic vote or a vote of the people, it wouldn't have happened, such as the right for women to vote, such as marriage equality. So we need those governmental all of a sudden putting things up to a vote that actually legislate how people get to live their lives. And I think that's an overreach of government. But I think it's also a hypocrisy because, again, those same people just a few years ago were saying that we don't want the government with my way of life. And to me, that's a travesty and a real red flag going forward because it can seep into other areas beyond just LGBTQ rights, right? And I think that's what I need people to understand is that if people start to find a way to legislate how we get to live our lives or what we get to believe or where we get to go, it will at some point come to affect some decision that you believe you should have the right to make. I think that's why it's really the principle, like not so much that I'm getting away from the trans issue, but I think it's bigger than that.
Because well, you said it before, right? What if I go to a library, what books can I read? I mean, that is pretty darn fundamental, right? Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. that's about freedom of speech and so on. So as soon as you get to book bannings, you have an issue. And then you can go into sort of religious, definition of what a religion is and what mm-hmm. the right religion is and whether we have state sponsorship. There are all these different practices that we've had debated since the founding of our nation. But I'd like to get to another point that you made, Timothy. Sure. And that is the whole issue of children growing up, right? Mm-hmm. I know and that's good, right? I was in my day susceptible to that, and my parents said, oh, that's probably just a fad, right? So there are, as children grow up, they're not necessarily equipped at all points to know their own minds and and so on. How does that actually work when you're talking about somebody who is, and we all do that. We all deal with our own gender, our own sexual identity, or our own place in the world. How does that work? What's going on is that we've got people who are judging what other people, what other families ought to, how they ought to navigate. And I don't know that's really appropriate here. But we also don't want,
That's where people are taking the rhetoric and saying, it's letting kids just do what they want. I don't agree with that. As a parent, as someone that's raised a kid, I don't agree with that. But I think to punish parents for wanting to be supportive of that kids to go through an evolutionary process where they actually do have the support and know that they are supported. But interestingly, when we talk about our LGBTQ Southern survey, we actually found out some really interesting things. 22.5% of our respondents reported being under 10 LGBTQ. And that's really interesting. People will say, I often hear from
22%. You said 22%?
22% of our survey respondents said, okay. and that aligns with my experience. Like I've had feelings that like I could grow up and I could love a man and I could love a woman. Like that was not a bizarre thought. And then we see that number jumps radically. So by the age people are 14, 58.1. So almost 60% of people that currently identify as LGBTQ had those.
I mean, that's hell right. Through that, right? I all of us, right? At a certain point, we're sort of discovering ourselves sexually. So
absolutely. But here's the thing, Mark. When did you realize you were a boy? At what age did you feel like I'm a boy? This is my gender. This is what feels right for me.
I guess. I don't know. 5, 6, before that, you don't really think in those terms, right?
Right. But I guess the point is like, I certainly understood my gender by the time I was 10, 12, like I'm comfortable, I'm a boy, right? And so there's this double speak with like, it's okay for some people to understand or even that, we talk about, I was watching this video of this 5-year-old kid taking flowers to this little girl, 5-year-old girl's house, and the parents followed them, and it's like, oh, like he's going to be such a gentleman, and look at how, how chivalrous this is, and this is amazing. And there were thousands about a 5-year-old boy taking flowers to a 5-year-old girl's house, but we don't call that grooming. Right? We don't say they're being groomed to be heterosexuals. So there's again a kind of double speak around like people being aware. And a 5-year-old kid can't have aspirations to someday be with a girl, but it's problematic if the 5-year-old kid feels like, oh, I might have a little crush on a boy. And then we say, that's not possible. You can't possibly know what you like. You can't possibly know your gender identity. Development of children when they come to know things. I think the important thing about that data point, which kind of hits on our access to books and literature and the censorship that's happening now, is if 58% of LGBTQ adults knew who they were at teen, then it's not like they're being groomed. It's that they want to see themselves reflected. They don't want to feel like a unicorn or some kind of weird person because
like me. It's like
exactly.
Me, right?
I want to see
about that age, right?
Right. And I think, for heterosexual people that they can model their lives off of. And essentially we're saying you can't be that because we're going to deny you the ability to see sort of a healthy example of what you could be in the future. And I think that's dangerous. That's what leads to the suicide among youth, is that the avenues that we had just a few years ago for supporting young people around that journey, even if they do turn 20 and change their mind, at least they feel like, you know what, I was supported in that journey. There is no harm in saying, wow, my parents supported me. I hadn't figured it all out, but I never once questioned if I'd be kicked out, if I would get bashed or beaten or anything harmful happen to me, because I'm literally just going through a developmental journey.
Well, it was a big sign out front, God, the original they, them, right? Which I thought was great. Now, we also do a lot of work for people who have different beliefs in that way. What you're basically saying is churches give room for civil society organizations to work it out rather than legislating. So how do we help that along? Because, one of the things that I don't want to end up with is these pendulum swings in which we're legislating, because of legislation that goes in one direction, that we legislate in the counter direction and force anything on anyone, right? We basically want to have an open civil society in which we can kind of work it out. A legislated society, which sort of starts to resemble, a top-down mind control kind of a regimen. How do we get there? Because that's part of what you're doing, Timon. What are you doing to create that circumstance?
Don't have two echo chambers screaming at each other that can't have conversation. Yeah, I really feel like that's where we need to get. I'm right now in the process of launching a youth advocacy fellowship where we're training very differently than you do. There's a mentor that I have great respect for, David Fleischer. He's out of Los Angeles, and he has this concept called deep canvassing. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's really a methodology around canvassing in communities principle, which is around finding the points of connection before you actually delve into what you disagree on. And so it's a real strategy that people can be trained in. Down south or in Arkansas, which is where I grew up, the common conversations may be the fact, then when I identify as queer, well, that person, and research has shown this, is more likely to listen to me and hear me out because I started with something that we have in common. I think the echo chambers exist because people's identities are rooted in, and it's this ideological war happening instead of, oh, you're a dad and I'm a dad too. Let's start there. To create a means for having a conversation. I think that's one thing, I don't know if it's NPR's like One Small Step or Story, or that show where they actually take two people, they're both ministers or they're both teachers, and they find that when people have something in common, that they're able to have more civil dialogue, and there's a respect for like that profession because there is that alignment. I think how can we example and begin to engage, because what I'm seeing is like red states and blue states, right?
Yeah, it's just nonsense.
And from your perspective, Mark, I would have issues if California, for example, which is often seen as like, that's the state that raised your kids that way. But I also would have an issue telling a family or a parent that like you can't teach your kids that being LGBTQ is against your religion. I think they deserve the right to also feel those psychological harm is happening, but we have to be in a space where people can believe different things, because I certainly want the ability to raise my kid with a set of beliefs. And again, I like what you said. What does it mean to create a kind of civil society where people get to work through and work out? If this is not what you believe, then you don't get to be here, right? What is it, Florida, where woke goes to die? Or, I think it was at a university here. If you want to do that, go somewhere else. That's really dangerous, right? And what if you don't need to be in America if you have a certain set of beliefs? When I think fundamentally that our democracy is really about creating a space where we do get to have different opinions and thoughts about things, and that the people that want to support and be nurturing the LGBT. Some states, Mark, that are actually banning trans affirming care for adults. Right? Not just kids. So like this whole thing of protect the kids, it's not about protecting the kids. It's about, I believe that they're only binary male and female, and anybody that's really dangerous, because at some point that issue is going to knock on something that you fundamentally cherish as a right that you have. And I think that's where we all have to come together. I think that's where the alignment and the mobilization, even people that don't understand fully about with what most people think. And I think that's something that I'm certainly reminded of, and certainly I hope our listeners today are thinking about.
I think part of what we need to do, Tim, is to make sure that everybody interest in the world that you're describing, as opposed to this world of circle the wagons. If I'm doing something as pedestrian as doing business with you, maybe, I'm buying not a terrible sandwich that's cheap, but you want me to come back and buy another sandwich from you.
Absolutely.
So you have to care about how I feel. That's how you end up being prosperous. And
yes.
It's not true for the country. I have to care how you feel, even if you're different, even if you have a different, maybe you like salami and I like pastrami, or I like, God knows, ham on whole wheat with mustard, right? You're going to serve me something that I like. I know that's
a great analogy, Mark.
Being considerate of
it's saying like, we're going to take ham off the menu because I think ham is bad for everybody. So you don't get access to that. And I think it's a really good metaphor and a really good analogy of like where we're moving in terms of a lot of this legislation and anti-trans, right?